Hi, it's Chris with Implied Music. What's the one thing in music that's uniquely yours that can't come out of a can, a box, a MIDI pack? What's that one thing that's a signature that's copyrightable? Today I want to talk about melody. Where to begin? Let's begin with melody. Where to begin? The fundamentals of music. We've been talking about naming notes, scales, modes, triads, seventh chords, diatonic harmony. We haven't really touched on some other components, very important components of music. Melody is a natural outgrowth of kind of all of those elements. And honestly, it's a little bit hard to teach because melody is a really strong heart message, isn't it? It comes from the sort of individual's intuition and just the integrity of your identity as a artist. We're going to try to talk about it, or at least talk about how to think about it, because thinking about your melodies and how to improve them is something that you can get better at. Before we do that, just a little housekeeping. If this is the second or third video of mine you've watched and you're not subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. It's really helps me out a lot. And take a look at some of the other Where to Begin videos in this series. I'll link them. Well worth the time. So we probably should begin with a little review. And what I want to review, first of all, is just the scale, the major scale, and some of its modes, because melody is directly related to scale, and we'll talk about why. The major scale, as we understand it, in Western music theory, has those 7 tones, and we talk about those tones as degrees. First degree, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, I can never say sixth, seventh, and eighth. Eighth is the same as 1. Really, there's only 7 notes in the scale. And each of these distances is a step. Some of the steps are whole steps. Some of the steps are half steps. They sound really natural and normal to our ears, despite the fact that they're different distances. And the distance between any 2 notes is an interval. It's well worth knowing the names of all the intervals. You can count the scale steps to get the interval or the distance. This is a second, a third, a fourth. I don't have to go from C. I could go from the second step of the scale, D, and I could get a second, a third, in this case, a minor third, a fourth. Melodies are made of intervals. And the very first thing I want you to notice about melodies and your melodies is how good melodies use a mix of intervals. Because melodies come out of the voice, the human voice, the easiest intervals to sing are in some ways the best intervals to use. I'll show you what I mean. This melody is made exclusively from steps until we get to that moment there where there's a tiny skip. So the distance between notes becomes a kind of an important part of the world. Here, let's zoom in a little bit more. There we go. Here you can see each of these tones is just moving by a step along the scale and then a repetition. What could be easier? The entire range of the melody is just from C up to G, a perfect fifth. And most people can sing at least that range. Good melodies use a mix of steps, skips, and sometimes leaps. Boldly beginning with a leap, and then apologizing with all steps. The repetition of those notes on the scale on the way down and the general repetition of each tone make Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or the alphabet song, however you want to sort of think of it, a great example of a strong leap, a kind of a big moment being sort of softened and apologized for by using just scale degrees in the rest of the melody. Good melodies live in a scale, use steps, skips, and sometimes leaps to create their identity. Melodies live in a scale, but they also live in chords. Take this simple chord progression: C, G, G, and then back to C. It's kind of what I would call a polka chord progression, right? The root chord, the 1 chord, alternated with the 5 chord. I can make a melody using just chord tones. It actually won't be that interesting, but let's just try. So, it really does sound sort of hokey and like classic polka, doesn't it? I was just outlining the chord tones with all those melodies. I did add the 7th because, after all, the 5 chord is very often a 7th. Not that interesting, but what if we do something called a passing or leading tone to some of those notes? I actually added notes between chord tones to create something a little more interesting, and you may have noticed this spicy tone here. Because it's beneath a chord tone, and there I also used the same trick. I went down to a B below the C and then back to the C itself. Because that half step below the chord tone wants to resolve to it, we completely accept it. You can use chord tones and notes in between the chord tones to create energy and excitement in your melodies. Notes in a scale have energy. When I was studying Indian classical music, our teacher made us play a sustain tone, a drone, and sing each of the notes of the scale against that drone. Listen to how the 9th, the 2nd step of the scale, wants to move. Listen to how the 3rd is harmonious and energetic at the same time. Listen to how the 4th step of the scale wants to move. Listen to how the 5th step of the scale is strong and stable. Listen to how the 6th step of the scale wants to move either back down to the 5th or up to the 7th, which itself has very strong leading tone motion back up to the top. Each note in the scale has a relationship to the tonic, and that relationship has energy. It's a big part of how we write melodies. Bach talked about melodic inventiveness. And melodic inventiveness, or just the capacity to create new melodies, is something which is really difficult to teach, to even describe. And yet there are countless rules, almost all of which have been kind of inscribed after the fact by observation of other great melodies, that we as composers and songwriters can use to write a good melody. What I will say is this: like any great work of art, a good melody has not only pleasing and stable components, but also elements of dissonance, of pain, of yearning. Those elements of yearning are very often the most important parts. One thing we see in pop music right now is the use of the 9th in chords. You know, I'm playing a D against this C chord. That repetition and use of the 9th, then first on the C chord and then on the G chord, gives us propulsion and energy and yearning. When you're looking for a new melody, when you're melodicizing a lyric, as a composer, you have a really first step challenge, which is to quiet your mind. Empty yourself of expectation and ask for something to come. Something will come. Ideas are usually not the problem. Melodic inventiveness is baked into us as musicians. We just naturally have it. It will be personal and unique. It will be yours. The only thing that's really yours as a musician is your melodies. Well, maybe lyrics, but that's poetry, isn't it? The only thing that's really yours is melody. As we go forward in the series, we'll talk about how the rhythmic components of melody are really important as well. Today, we've just kind of looked at how melodic tones interact and how they move forward. And we've just begun talking about how to think about what we're doing melodically. And we've kind of worked rather slowly, and I think that's not a bad idea. What are some of your best melodic tricks? Almost every musician has a few favorite things they like to do. Me, I love that half step below the chord tone trick. It's like my bread and butter. Well, I hope this has been useful. Like and subscribe, ding the bell. You'll be notified when I do my videos. I'll see you next time.